The dust cloud billowed across the horizon as the wagon train rattled westward. But no one noticed when Abigail Lambert tumbled from the rear wagon, her wedding dress catching on a jagged piece of wood as she was thrown onto the hard, unforgiving earth of the Texas plains. The year was 1875, and for Abigail, this moment marked the end of one life and the unexpected beginning of another. She lay there, the wind knocked from her lungs, her ivory dress now stained with the ruddy soil of the frontier. The wagon train continued its relentless journey, oblivious to her absence. Pain shot through her ankle as she attempted to stand, and she collapsed back into the dust with a whimper. The sun beat down mercilessly on her fair skin, and panic began to set in as she realized her predicament. "Help." She called out, her voice thin against the vast emptiness surrounding her. "Please, someone help me." But the wagon train was already a distant silhouette against the setting sun, and her cries went unheard. Tears streaked down her dirt-smudged face as she contemplated her fate. At 20 years old, having left behind everything familiar in Boston to marry a man she'd only corresponded with through letters, Abigail now found herself utterly alone in the wilderness. As the shadows lengthened across the plains, she heard the steady rhythm of hoofbeats approaching. Fear and hope warred within her as she strained to see the rider. A tall figure on horseback emerged from the gathering dusk, the silhouette of a wide-brimmed hat distinctive against the crimson sky. The horse slowed to a stop beside her, and the rider dismounted in one fluid motion. He knelt beside her, his face shadowed beneath his hat, but she could make out the strong line of his jaw, dusted with several days' worth of stubble. "Well now," he said, his voice deep and rough like gravel, "what do we have here? A bride fallen from the sky." "I fell from the wagon train," Abigail explained, her voice quavering. "They didn't notice. Please, sir, I need help." The man surveyed the empty horizon, then looked back at her, taking in her torn wedding dress and the desperation in her eyes. With a decisive movement, he removed his hat, revealing piercing blue eyes that assessed her with undisguised interest. "Name's Alexander Evans," he said, extending a calloused hand. "Most folks call me Alex." "Abigail Lambert," she replied, tentatively placing her gloved hand in his. "I'm to be married in Red Rock." A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth as he gently lifted her into his arms. The sudden proximity to this stranger made her breath catch, but she had little choice but to trust him. "Well, Miss Lambert," he said, settling her on his horse before mounting behind her, his arms encircling her as he took the reins. "Seems to me fate has other plans. You're mine now, at least until we can get you someplace safe." She stiffened at his words, but as they rode into the gathering darkness, the steady beat of his heart against her back became an unexpected comfort in a world suddenly turned upside down. They rode in silence for what seemed like hours, the rhythmic gait of the horse lulling Abigail into an uneasy doze despite her circumstances. She awoke with a start when the horse stopped, and she realized they had arrived at a small homestead nestled against a copse of trees. "This is your home?" she asked, her voice hoarse from the dusty ride. "For now," Alex replied, dismounting and reaching up to help her down. "It's not much, but it's shelter." As her feet touched the ground, pain shot through her ankle again, causing her to stumble against his chest. His arms steadied her, strong and secure, and for a moment they stood too close, her face tilted up to his, illuminated by the moonlight. "You're hurt," he observed, concern evident in his voice. "It's just my ankle," she assured him. "I think I twisted it when I fell." Without warning, he swept her into his arms again and carried her toward the cabin. "Let's get you inside and take a look at that." The cabin was sparse but tidy, with a small table, 2 chairs, a stone fireplace, and a narrow bed in the corner. Alex set her down gently on one of the chairs and lit a lantern, casting a warm glow throughout the single room. "Are you alone out here?" Abigail asked, suddenly aware of the intimacy of their situation. "Just me and Thunder," he replied, referring to his horse. "Been that way for a couple years now." He knelt before her and carefully removed her dusty, torn slipper. His touch was surprisingly gentle for hands so weathered by hard work. "This might hurt a bit," he warned before examining her ankle. Abigail bit her lip as he probed the swollen area. "It's not broken," he declared finally. "Just a bad sprain, you were lucky." "Lucky," she repeated, unable to keep the bitterness from her voice. "I've been thrown from a wagon, separated from my belongings, my future husband, everything I've traveled so far to reach." Alex stood and moved to a small cupboard, retrieving a bottle and some strips of cloth. "And yet," he said quietly, "you're alive and not facing the night alone on the plains where wolves or worse might have found you." Shame colored her cheeks at his words. "You're right, of course." "I apologize for my ingratitude. Thank you for rescuing me, Mr. Evans." "Alex," he corrected, returning to kneel before her. He poured some liquid from the bottle onto a cloth. "This is going to sting," she gasped as the whiskey-soaked cloth touched her abraded skin but didn't pull away. As he worked, wrapping her ankle with practiced efficiency, she studied him more carefully. He was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps in his late 20s, with sun-bronzed skin and lines at the corners of his eyes that hinted at squinting against the sun. His hands, though rough with calluses, moved with a deftness that spoke of self-sufficiency. "How far are we from Red Rock?" she asked as he finished tending her injury. "3 days' ride, maybe 4 with your injury," he replied, rising to his feet. "But that wagon train won't wait. If your intended is there, he'll think you've changed your mind when you don't arrive." The thought struck her like a physical blow. Henry Blackwell, her fiancé, was a successful merchant who had advertised for a bride in the Eastern newspapers. Their courtship had consisted entirely of letters exchanged over 6 months, culminating in his sending funds for her journey west. What would he think when the wagon train arrived without her? "I have to get to Red Rock," she insisted. "Henry will be waiting. He paid for my passage." Something flickered in Alex's eyes, disapproval, perhaps, but he merely nodded. "We'll start at first light. You need rest now. Take the bed. I'll sleep by the fire." "I couldn't possibly. You can and you will," he interrupted firmly. "You're injured and exhausted." "I've slept on worse than a wooden floor many times." Too tired to argue further, Abigail accepted his offer. He turned his back discreetly as she removed the outer layer of her ruined wedding dress, leaving her in her chemise and petticoat. She slipped beneath the rough woolen blanket, acutely aware of the stranger moving about the cabin, banking the fire for the night. As the lantern was extinguished and darkness enveloped them, separated only by the dim glow of the dying embers, Abigail found herself wondering what twist of fate had thrown her into the path of this solitary cowboy. His words echoed in her mind as sleep finally claimed her. "You're mine now." Morning came with the crowing of a rooster, startling Abigail from a deep sleep. For a moment, disorientation gripped her as she stared at the unfamiliar ceiling of rough-hewn logs. Then the events of the previous day came rushing back: the fall from the wagon, the mysterious cowboy, her injured ankle. She sat up, wincing at the soreness that permeated her body, and found herself alone in the cabin. Sunlight streamed through the single window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. A cup of water and a clean shirt had been left on the table beside the bed, along with a note scrawled on a scrap of paper. "Gone to tend the animals, back soon. A.E." Abigail tested her ankle gingerly. It was still swollen and painful, but she could put some weight on it. She hobbled to the water basin in the corner, splashed her face, and did her best to tidy her appearance with the limited resources available. The shirt he'd left was far too large for her slender frame, but it was clean, and her own clothing was in tatters. She had just settled back on the edge of the bed, the oversized shirt belted with a strip of fabric torn from her ruined petticoat, when the door swung open and Alex entered, carrying a pail of milk and a basket of eggs. He stopped short at the sight of her in his shirt, an unexpected expression crossing his face before he quickly masked it. "You're up. Good. How's the ankle?" "Better, thank you," she replied, suddenly self-conscious under his gaze. "I hope you don't mind that I borrowed your shirt." "It suits you," he said simply, crossing to the small stove in the corner. Hungry, at the mention of food, her stomach growled loudly, causing a blush to rise to her cheeks. "Starving, actually." A smile tugged at his lips as he set about preparing a simple breakfast. Not much fancy out here, I'm afraid. Eggs, biscuits, and coffee is about the extent of my culinary skills. It sounds wonderful, she assured him, watching as he worked with the same efficient movements she'd noticed the night before. There was something compelling about his self-contained competence, so different from the fussy, over-attentive men she'd known in Boston. As they ate, seated across from each other at the small table, Abigail ventured to learn more about her rescuer. "Have you lived in this territory long?" Alex nodded, swallowing a mouthful of coffee before answering. "Born in Kentucky, but I've been out west since I was 18. Worked as a ranch hand, tried my luck in the gold fields, scouted for the army for a spell. This place is the first I've called my own. And no wife." The question slipped out before she could consider its propriety, and she immediately regretted it. "I apologize, that was terribly forward of me." To her relief, he didn't seem offended. "No wife," he confirmed. "Never found a woman willing to share this kind of life." "It's not easy out here for a city-bred lady." His eyes met hers across the table, and the implication in his words hung between them. Was he suggesting that she too was unsuited for frontier life? The thought stung more than it should have. "My intended, mister." "Blackwell is a merchant," she said, lifting her chin slightly. "We'll live in town, not out on the frontier." "Red Rock isn't exactly Boston," Alex pointed out. "It's a rough place still. No theater, no fancy shops. Just a dusty street with a general store, a saloon, and folks trying to carve out a living." Doubt nibbled at the edges of her confidence. Henry's letters had painted a more civilized picture of their future home, describing a growing community with opportunities for refinement and society. Had he embellished to entice her westward? "I'm not afraid of hard work or simple living," she said, more to convince herself than him. "My father died when I was 16, and my mother and I had to take in sewing to survive. I'm not as delicate as I appear, Mr. Evans." Something like respect flickered in his eyes. "Never said you were, Miss Lambert." After breakfast, Alex brought out a map and spread it on the table between them. "Here's where we are," he said, pointing to a spot seemingly in the middle of nowhere. "And here's Red Rock." His finger moved to a mark several inches away. "Normally, I'd take the main trail, but with your ankle, we might be better off following the creek here. It's longer but easier going, and there's good places to camp with water and shelter." "How long will it take?" Abigail asked, trying to absorb the geography of this unfamiliar land. 4 days, if we're lucky with the weather. Your ankle needs at least one more day of rest before we attempt the journey." She wanted to protest the delay, but knew he was right. Even sitting at the table had caused her ankle to throb anew. "What about the wagon train? Is there any way to send word ahead to Red Rock?" Alex shook his head. "No telegraph in these parts yet. The stage might pass through in a few days, but it's not reliable." "Best we can do is make our own way there." Resignation settled over her. "Then I'm entirely at your mercy, it seems." He folded the map carefully, his eyes never leaving hers. "I gave you my word I'd get you to Red Rock, Miss Lambert. I don't make promises lightly." "Please," she said softly, "if we're to travel together for days, you might as well call me Abigail." A slight smile crossed his face. "Abigail, then." The day passed slowly as Abigail rested her ankle and Alex attended to chores around the homestead. He brought her a book to read, a worn copy of The Last of the Mohicans, and she lost herself in its pages, grateful for the distraction. Occasionally, she would look up to find him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher before he quickly returned to his tasks. As evening approached, he set out again, returning with a rabbit he'd snared. Abigail insisted on helping prepare the meal despite her injury, and they worked together in companionable silence, the small cabin filled with the savory aroma of stew simmering on the stove. "Tell me about Henry Blackwell," Alex said suddenly as they ate. "What kind of man advertises for a bride from thousands of miles away?" The question caught her off guard. "He's a respectable businessman," she replied defensively. "His letters were intelligent and kind. He wrote that he's established a successful trading post and needs a wife to help create a proper home." "And you've never met him?" "No," she admitted, "but many marriages begin this way in the territories. Not everyone has the luxury of long courtships." Alex's expression remained neutral, but something in his eyes suggested disapproval. What made you answer his advertisement? Surely a woman like you had suitors in Boston. Abigail stared into her bowl, uncomfortable with the personal turn of the conversation. Yet something about Alex's direct manner made her want to be honest. After my father died, our circumstances changed dramatically. The men who once called on me disappeared when our social standing fell. When my mother passed away last winter, I was left with little money and fewer prospects. She lifted her gaze to meet his. Mr. Blackwell offered security and a fresh start. It seemed practical. Practical, he repeated, the words sounding hollow between them. Is that what marriage should be? What would you have me do? She asked, a flash of anger warming her cheeks. Wait for love like some character in a novel. Life isn't a storybook, Mr. Evans. Sometimes we must make the best choices available to us. He set down his spoon, regarding her thoughtfully. You're right. I've no place judging your decisions. But having seen what life demands of women out here, I wouldn't wish it on anyone who wasn't entering it with open eyes. His concern touched her, despite her irritation. I appreciate your concern, truly, but I've made my choice. Later, as they prepared for sleep with the same arrangements as the night before, Abigail found herself wondering what kind of wife Alex Evans might seek if he ever decided to marry. She pushed the thought away as quickly as it came. Tomorrow they would begin their journey to Red Rock and to the future she had chosen for herself. Dawn broke with a sky-threatening rain, but Alex insisted they set out nonetheless. Weather changes quick out here, he explained as he helped Abigail onto his horse. Better to make progress while we can. He had fashioned a makeshift stirrup that allowed her to ride side-saddle without putting pressure on her injured ankle, and had packed provisions, a bedroll, and a small tent onto a pack-horse he called Penny due to her copper-colored coat. You've thought of everything, Abigail observed, impressed by his foresight. Comes from living out here, he replied, adjusting the saddle one final time. You learn to prepare or you don't survive long. He mounted behind her, his chest warm against her back as he reached around her for the reins. The intimate position made her acutely aware of him in a way that both unsettled and intrigued her. They set off at a steady pace, the pack-horse trailing behind them on a lead rope. The landscape unfolded before them as they rode rolling hills giving way to stretches of prairie dotted with wildflowers, occasional stands of trees marking the courses of streams and creeks. Alex pointed out landmarks and shared stories of the land, his deep voice rumbling against her back. He knew the names of plants and animals, could read the weather from the clouds, and seemed to navigate as easily as she might walk a familiar street in Boston. By midday, the threatened rain had not materialized, but the sky remained overcast, offering relief from the sun. They stopped to rest by a small creek, and Alex helped Abigail dismount, his hands strong at her waist. The brief contact left her oddly breathless. How's the ankle? He asked, steadying her as she tested her weight on it. Stiff, but not as painful, she admitted. Your wrapping helped. He nodded, satisfied, and busied himself with preparing a simple meal of jerky, hard cheese, and biscuits left from breakfast. They ate sitting side by side on a fallen log, watching the horses drink from the clear creek. Tell me about your life before, Abigail said, breaking the comfortable silence. You mentioned Kentucky. A shadow crossed his face, and for a moment she thought he might not answer. My father owned a small horse farm, he finally said. Nothing fancy, but it was a good life. He taught me everything about horses, about reading the land. My mother died when I was young, but I remember her singing. She had the voice of an angel. What brought you west? His jaw tightened. The war. I fought for the Union. When I came home, everything was changed. My father had died, the farm was in ruins. There was nothing left for me there. Abigail absorbed this, understanding better the self-contained man beside her. I'm sorry, she said simply. He shrugged, but his eyes softened slightly. It was a long time ago. Out here, a man can start fresh, be judged by what he does, not where he came from or which side he fought on. Is that why you live alone, so far from town? Partly, he admitted. And partly because I've seen how quickly towns can change a person. The drink, the gambling, the constant striving for more than what you have. Out here, things are simpler, true. There was a wisdom in his words that resonated with her despite how different their lives had been. Yet you're helping me reach Red Rock, she observed. Taking time away from your home to escort a stranger to the very kind of place you avoid. A smile played at the corners of his mouth. Maybe I'm not as wise as I sound. They continued their journey through the afternoon, the rhythm of the horse's gait and the warmth of Alex's presence lulling Abigail into a contemplative mood. She found herself wondering what life might have been like had she met someone like Alex in Boston, someone direct and honest, unbound by the social pretensions that had defined her world. As the daylight began to fade, Alex guided them toward a sheltered spot near another creek, where a stand of cottonwoods offered protection from the wind that had begun to pick up. "We'll camp here for the night," he announced, dismounting and reaching up to help her down. His hands lingered at her waist a moment longer than necessary, and when she looked up, their faces were unexpectedly close. Something flickered in his eyes, a momentary vulnerability that vanished as quickly as it had appeared. "Let me set up camp," he said, releasing her and turning to the packhorse. "You should rest that ankle." Abigail watched as he efficiently unpacked their supplies and erected the small tent. Despite her protests that she could help, he insisted she sit on a fallen log while he worked. In short order, he had a fire crackling, the horses picketed where they could graze, and water fetched from the creek. "You've done this before," she observed as he prepared a simple supper over the fire. "Many times," he confirmed. "The frontier has been my home for nearly a decade now." "Don't you ever get lonely?" The question slipped out before she could reconsider its personal nature. He looked up from the fire, his face half in shadow. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but I've learned to be comfortable with solitude. What about you? Will you miss Boston?" "Parts of it," she said thoughtfully. "The libraries, the music, but not the constraints, the endless rules about who could associate with whom based on wealth or family connections. Red Rock has its own hierarchies," he warned. "Different from Boston, perhaps, but they exist nonetheless." "Then I shall have to find my place within them," she replied with more confidence than she felt. As they ate beneath the darkening sky, the first stars appearing overhead, Abigail felt a curious sense of peace despite the uncertainty of her situation. There was something about Alex's quiet competence, his straightforward manner, that made her feel safer than she had in years. The wind picked up as night fell completely, bringing with it a chill that had Abigail shivering despite her proximity to the fire. Without a word, Alex rose and retrieved a wool blanket from his pack, draping it around her shoulders. "Thank you," she said, looking up to find his face much closer than she'd expected. "We should turn in," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "Long day tomorrow." He banked the fire carefully, then gestured toward the tent. "It's small, but it will keep you dry if it rains. I'll sleep out here." Abigail glanced at the darkening sky, where clouds now obscured the stars. "You'll catch your death out here if it storms. Surely we can." "Share the tent without impropriety." Alex's expression was unreadable in the firelight. "Are you certain?" She nodded, though her heart beat faster at the suggestion. "We're both adults, and I would feel terrible if you became ill on my account." Without further discussion, they prepared for sleep. Alex laid out the bedrolls side by side in the small tent, leaving as much space between them as the confined area would allow. He waited outside while Abigail settled herself, entering only when she indicated she was decent and comfortable. The tent was indeed small, and despite their efforts to maintain distance, Abigail was acutely aware of his presence beside her, the sound of his breathing, the warmth radiating from his body. She lay rigid with tension, staring up at the canvas above them. "Relax," Alex said quietly into the darkness. "I gave you my word to see you safely to Red Rock. That includes your virtue." His teasing tone broke the tension, and Abigail couldn't help but laugh softly. "I trust you, Alex, truly." "Good," he replied, his voice warm in the darkness. "Now sleep. We've many miles to cover tomorrow." But sleep proved elusive as Abigail lay listening to the wind rustling the trees outside and the steady rhythm of Alex's breathing beside her. She found herself wondering what Henry Blackwell would think if he could see her now, lying beside a stranger in a tent in the wilderness. The thought should have troubled her, but instead it filled her with an unexpected sense of freedom. When she finally drifted off, it was to dreams of endless prairie skies and a pair of blue eyes that seemed to see straight through to her soul. She awoke to the patter of rain on canvas and the absence of Alex beside her. Pushing herself up on her elbows, she peered out of the tent to see him crouched by a small fire he'd somehow managed to keep burning despite the drizzle, a coffee pot nestled in the coals. "Morning," he called, noticing her watching him. "Sleep well." "Better than I expected," she admitted, crawling out of the tent and standing carefully, testing her ankle. "The rain doesn't look like it will stop soon." "It's just a light spring shower," he said, pouring coffee into a tin cup and offering it to her. "Should clear by midday. How's the ankle?" "Much improved," she replied, accepting the coffee gratefully. "I think I could ride on my own today if needed." He studied her for a moment, then shook his head. "Better not to risk it. We've still got a ways to go." They breakfasted on the last of the biscuits and some dried fruit, then broke camp efficiently despite the rain. Alex was meticulous about packing everything properly, explaining that wet supplies could be ruinous on a long journey. Once again, Abigail found herself impressed by his practical knowledge and self-sufficiency. As they rode through the misty morning, the countryside took on an ethereal quality, colors muted and sounds dampened by the gentle rainfall. Alex kept them at a steady pace, occasionally pointing out landmarks or sharing bits of information about the territory. Abigail asked questions about the plants and animals they encountered, genuinely interested in understanding this new world. "You're different from most Eastern women I've met," Alex observed after she'd enthusiastically identified a prairie flower he'd taught her about the day before. "Is that a compliment?" she asked, glancing back at him over her shoulder. "Definitely," he confirmed, a smile in his voice. "Most would be complaining about the rain, the discomfort, the lack of proper accommodations." "Perhaps I'm simply making the best of my circumstances," she suggested, though in truth, she was enjoying the journey far more than she would have expected. "Or perhaps there's more frontier spirit in you than you realized," he countered. The thought stayed with her throughout the day as they traveled. Had she underestimated her own capacity for adaptation? The woman who had left Boston had been desperate and afraid, clutching at the promise of security that Henry Blackwell offered. But the woman riding through the rain with Alex felt somehow different, more alive, more aware of the beauty and possibility surrounding her. By late afternoon, the rain had indeed stopped, and the sun broke through the clouds, transforming the wet landscape into a glistening wonderland. They stopped to rest the horses by a swollen creek, and Abigail insisted on stretching her legs despite Alex's concerns about her ankle. "It's truly much better," she assured him, walking a few steps to demonstrate. "See, hardly a limp at all." He watched her with a mixture of concern and admiration. "You're tougher than you look, Abigail Lambert." "Thank you," she replied, pleased by the assessment. "Though I'm not sure what that says about how I look." His eyes traveled over her then, taking in her bedraggled appearance, her hair escaping its pins, her borrowed clothes damp from the rain, her face flushed from the fresh air. "You look," he began, then seemed to catch himself. "You look like you belong out here more than you might think." Something in his gaze made her breath catch, and for a moment, the world seemed to narrow to just the two of them, standing beside a creek in the middle of nowhere. Then thunder nickered impatiently, breaking the spell. "We should keep moving," Alex said, turning abruptly to check the horse's saddle. "There's a place about 2 hours' ride from here where we can make camp, better shelter if the rain returns." Abigail nodded, unsettled by the intensity of the moment that had just passed between them. What was happening to her? She was engaged to be married, traveling to meet her fiancé. These confusing feelings for Alex were surely just a result of their unusual circumstances, of his kindness and her vulnerability. Yet as they continued their journey, she couldn't deny the warmth that spread through her each time his arms tightened around her to navigate a difficult stretch of terrain. or the pleasure she took in making him laugh with her observations and questions. True to his word, Alex led them to an ideal camping spot as evening approached a small clearing protected by a natural overhang of rock that would keep them dry even if the rain returned. A nearby spring provided fresh water, and there was ample grazing for the horses. "How do you know all these places?" Abigail asked as she helped him unpack, insisting on taking an active role despite his protests. "Years of travel," he replied, efficiently starting a fire. "When you live out here, you learn to read the land to find the safe spots, the water sources." "You make it sound so simple." "Not simple," he corrected, "but essential. The land will sustain you if you understand it, respect it. It will kill you if you don't." The stark assessment reminded her of the harsh realities of frontier life, so different from the protected existence she'd known in Boston. "Is that why you warned me about coming west? You think I can't adapt to this life?" Alex paused in his work, regarding her seriously. "I think anyone can adapt, given time and proper guidance. My concern is that your Henry Blackwell hasn't prepared you for the realities you'll face." "He's not my Henry," she corrected automatically, then wondered why that distinction seemed so important to make. Alex merely nodded, returning to his task of preparing their evening meal. They worked together companionably, and as darkness fell, they sat side by side beneath the rock overhang, watching the stars emerge in the clearing sky. "We should reach Red Rock by tomorrow evening," Alex said quietly, breaking a long, comfortable silence. The statement, though expected, hit Abigail with unexpected force. Tomorrow. Tomorrow she would meet Henry Blackwell, the man she had agreed to marry. Tomorrow this strange, magical interlude with Alex would end. "What will you do after?" she asked, not looking at him. "After you've delivered me safely to my destination." He was quiet for so long that she thought he might not answer. "Head back to my place," he finally said. "There's always work to be done." "Alone," she said, the word more a statement than a question. "As I've been," he confirmed. Then, so softly she almost didn't hear it, "though it might be harder now." Her heart quickened at his words, but before she could respond, he stood abruptly. "We should get some rest. Long day tomorrow." That night, as they once again shared the small tent, Abigail lay awake long after Alex's breathing had deepened into sleep. She found herself memorizing the outline of his profile in the dim light, the sound of his steady breathing, the safe feeling of his presence beside her. Tomorrow everything would change. Tomorrow she would meet the man who would be her husband, begin the life she had committed to when she answered his advertisement. It was the practical choice, the sensible path, so why did it suddenly feel like the hardest thing she would ever do? Morning came too quickly, the sun streaming through the canvas of the tent and warming Abigail's face. She opened her eyes to find herself alone again, Alex's bedroll already neatly packed away. The familiar sounds of him moving about outside the tent brought a bittersweet pang to her chest. Today. They would reach Red Rock today. She dressed quickly and emerged to find Alex tending the horses, his back to her as he adjusted Penny's pack saddle. He turned at the sound of her approach, and for a brief moment, his expression was unguarded, a mixture of longing and resignation that made her heart ache. "Good morning," she said, suddenly shy in a way she hadn't been before. "Morning," he replied, his face settling back into its usual composed lines. "There's coffee by the fire. We should eat quickly and get moving. Got a lot of ground to cover today." The easy camaraderie of previous days seemed muted as they prepared for the final leg of their journey. They spoke little as they ate and packed up camp, each lost in their own thoughts. When it came time to mount up, Alex lifted her onto Thunder with the same care as always, but there was a new tension in the set of his shoulders, a deliberate space between them as he settled behind her. The countryside they traversed that day was increasingly populated small homesteads dotting the landscape, occasional fellow travelers on the trail who nodded greetings as they passed. Signs of civilization that told Abigail they were indeed approaching their destination. By mid-afternoon, Alex pointed to a smudge on the horizon. "Red Rock," he said simply. "We'll be there before sundown." Abigail's stomach twisted with a mixture of anticipation and dread. Will you stay after you've brought me to Mr. Blackwell?" His arms tightened briefly around her, then relaxed. "I don't think that would be wise." "But how will you know I'm safe, that he's what he claimed to be in his letters?" "Is that what you're worried about?" Alex asked, his voice close to her ear. "Partly," she admitted, though it wasn't the whole truth. The whole truth was too complicated, too raw to voice aloud. "I'll see you safely to his door," Alex promised. "Make sure he's a man of his word before I leave." The relief she felt was tempered by the finality in his tone. This was really happening. In a few hours, she would say goodbye to Alex Evans and hello to the future she had chosen. As the afternoon wore on, Red Rock grew from a smudge to a distinct collection of buildings, a proper frontier town with a main street, wooden sidewalks, and various establishments whose signs became legible as they approached. Alex guided them down a side trail that followed a small river, explaining that it would bring them into town from the east, where the merchant district was located. "Blackwell's trading post should be near the center of town," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "If it's as successful as he claimed, it won't be hard to find." Abigail nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. The time for conversation, for connection, was slipping away with every hoofbeat. They crested a small rise, and suddenly Red Rock lay before them in its entirety, a bustling frontier town nestled in a valley, with mountains rising in the distance beyond. It was larger than Abigail had expected, with perhaps 50 or 60 buildings arranged along several intersecting streets. Smoke rose from chimneys, wagons and riders moved along the main thoroughfare, and the sounds of civilization hammering voices, the distant piano from a saloon drifted up to them on the breeze. "It's bigger than I imagined," she said, breaking their long silence. "It's grown fast," Alex agreed. "The railroad's coming through next year. That always changes things." They descended into the town, drawing curious glances from passers-by who noted Abigail's unusual attire and their shared mount. Alex ignored the looks, guiding Thunder confidently down the main street, his eyes scanning the storefronts until he spotted what they were seeking. "There," he said, pointing to a large establishment with Blackwell's trading post and general merchandise painted in bold letters across its facade. "Looks like your intended did well for himself." The building was indeed impressive, 2 stories tall, with large display windows and a wide porch out front. Several customers were entering and exiting, and a wagon was being loaded with goods at the side. Abigail stared at the building, her destiny made manifest in wood and glass and paint. This was it. The end of their journey, the beginning of her new life. Alex brought Thunder to a halt a short distance from the store, dismounting first and then reaching up to help Abigail down. His hands at her waist felt different, somehow more hesitant, as though he too sensed the finality of this moment. "Thank you," she said softly as her feet touched the ground, meaning far more than just the assistance in dismounting. "You're welcome," he replied, his eyes holding hers for a long moment before he released her and stepped back. They stood facing each other on the busy street, suddenly awkward where they had been so comfortable. Abigail's ankle, though much improved, still twinged as she shifted her weight, a physical reminder of how they had come to be here together. "Well," Alex said finally, gesturing toward the store, "shall we meet the man who's to be your husband?" The word husband in Alex's mouth sounded wrong somehow, but Abigail nodded, squaring her shoulders. "Yes, I suppose we should." Alex took Thunder's reins in one hand and offered his other arm to Abigail, a courtly gesture that touched her deeply. She placed her hand on his forearm, feeling the solid strength beneath the worn fabric of his shirt, and together they approached Blackwell's trading post. The interior of the store was well stocked and busy, with customers examining goods ranging from farm implements to fabric, from canned goods to firearms. A clerk was helping a woman select ribbons, while at the far end of the counter, a portly man with a luxuriant mustache was engaged in what appeared to be a business discussion with 2 well-dressed gentlemen. "That's him," Abigail whispered, recognizing Henry Blackwell from the small daguerreotype he had sent with one of his letters. The man at the counter with the mustache. Alex's expression remained carefully neutral as he assessed the merchant. "Let's introduce ourselves then." They made their way through the store, Abigail growing more nervous with each step. What would Henry think of her appearance? Of her arriving with a strange man? Would he even recognize her, disheveled and dressed in borrowed clothing? The merchant looked up as they approached, his conversation trailing off as he took in the unusual pair. His eyes widened in what might have been recognition, but before he could speak, a woman emerged from a doorway behind the counter. "Henry, the Edwards order is ready for O." She stopped short at the sight of Abigail and Alex. "I didn't realize you had customers waiting." Abigail froze, staring at the woman who had addressed Henry Blackwell with such familiarity. She was attractive, perhaps 30 years old, with a practical but becoming dress and her hair neatly arranged. "Not customers, my dear," Henry replied, his eyes fixed on Abigail with growing recognition. "Unless I'm much mistaken, this is Miss Lambert from Boston." The woman's expression shifted from polite interest to shock. "Miss Lambert, but I thought, the wagon train arrived yesterday and when you weren't on it." "There was an accident," Abigail said, finding her voice at last. "I fell from the wagon. Mr. Evans found me and has brought me to Red Rock." Henry stepped forward, extending his hand, though whether to Abigail or Alex was unclear. "Henry Blackwell at your service, and this is my wife, Margaret." "Wife," Abigail repeated, certain she had misheard. "Yes, we were married 3 weeks ago," Margaret said, looking distinctly uncomfortable. "When you didn't arrive with the wagon train, Henry assumed you had changed your mind about coming west." "I don't understand," Abigail said faintly, feeling as though the floor had dropped away beneath her feet. "Your letters, the money you sent for my journey." Henry had the grace to look abashed. "I did write to you, yes, and I did send for you, but when weeks passed with no reply to my last letter, I assumed you had reconsidered. Margaret here had just lost her husband to fever and, well, circumstances change." Alex's hand moved to Abigail's elbow, steadying her as the full import of the situation washed over her. "You married someone else," she said numbly, "without even waiting to be certain I wasn't coming." "The wagon train arrived," Henry repeated, as though this explained everything. "You weren't on it. What was I to think?" "Perhaps that she might have met with misfortune on the journey," Alex suggested, his voice dangerously quiet. "Perhaps that she deserved the courtesy of confirmation before you gave her position to another," Henry bristled at the criticism. "Now see here, I had no obligation to, it's all right," Abigail interrupted, finding her composure despite the shock. "What's done is done. I wish you both every happiness." Margaret, looking genuinely distressed, came around the counter to approach Abigail. "Miss Lambert, I had no idea. Henry didn't tell me he had sent for a bride. I would never have." "Please," Abigail said, raising a hand to stop her, "you have nothing to apologize for. The fault is not yours." "Where will you go?" Margaret asked, concern evident in her voice. "Do you have funds to return east?" The question brought Abigail up short. Where would she go? She had spent nearly all her savings on the journey west, counting on Henry's promise of marriage and security. The reality of her situation crashed over her. She was alone, nearly penniless in a frontier town thousands of miles from anything familiar. "I'll manage," she said with more confidence than she felt. "Miss Lambert will be fine," Alex stated firmly, his hand still supportive at her elbow. "I'll see to it." Henry, who had been watching the exchange with evident discomfort, suddenly seemed eager to make amends. "Of course, I'll refund the cost of your journey. It's only fair. And perhaps we can help you find a position here in town. The school is in need of a teacher if you have education." "I taught briefly in Boston," Abigail acknowledged, grasping at this unexpected opportunity, "but I would need somewhere to stay while I establish myself." "Mrs. Holloway runs a respectable boarding house," Margaret offered quickly. "I'm sure she would have a room, and I could speak to Reverend Parker about the teaching position." "That's very kind," Abigail said, genuinely touched by the woman's desire to help, despite the awkwardness of their situation. Alex, who had been silent during this exchange, spoke up. "If you'll excuse us, I believe Miss Lambert could use some time to collect herself after this. Unexpected development. Perhaps we could return tomorrow to discuss these arrangements further." Henry nodded eagerly, clearly relieved at the prospect of postponing the uncomfortable conversation. Of course. We'll have your refund ready and Margaret will inquire about the boarding house and the teaching position." "Thank you," Abigail said, allowing Alex to guide her toward the door. She felt oddly detached, as though watching the scene unfold from a distance. Outside on the street, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the dusty thoroughfare. Abigail stood beside Thunder, her mind whirling with the implications of what had just transpired. Everything she had planned, everything she had counted on, had vanished in an instant. "Are you all right?" Alex asked quietly, his hand still at her elbow. "I don't know," she admitted, looking up at him with bewildered eyes. "I came all this way and now you're free," he said simply. The words hung between them, laden with possibility. Free. She was free from an engagement to a man who had proven himself unworthy of her trust, free from a hasty decision made in desperation, free to choose a different path. "I have nowhere to go," she said, the reality of her situation settling in. No home, almost no money. "You have options," Alex countered. "The teaching position sounds promising, and from what I saw of Blackwell, he'll pay you what he owes out of guilt, if nothing else." Abigail nodded, trying to focus on practical matters rather than the swirl of emotions threatening to overwhelm her. "The boarding house Margaret mentioned would be a good start, at least until I can establish myself." "Or," Alex said, his voice careful, measured, "you could come back with me." She stared at him, certain she had misunderstood. "Back to your homestead," he nodded, his eyes never leaving hers. "It's not much, as you've seen, but there's room. And time for you to decide what you truly want without pressure or necessity driving your choice." "Alex," she breathed, scarcely able to believe what he was offering. "Why would you do that?" A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, transforming his serious face. "Because from the moment I found you lying in the dust in that torn wedding dress, something told me you were meant to cross my path. Because these past days have shown me that you're stronger and braver than even you realize." "Because," he broke off, seeming to struggle for words. "Because what?" she prompted, her heart hammering in her chest. "Because when I lifted you up and said you're mine now, part of me wasn't just talking about getting you to safety," he admitted, the words rushing out as though he'd held them back too long. "I know it's too soon. I know you need time. But I also know that I don't want to ride away from Red Rock without you, Abigail Lambert." The directness of his declaration took her breath away. Here was no careful courtship through letters, no calculated promises of security and comfort. Just a man standing before her with his heart in his eyes, offering what he had and asking for a chance. "It won't be easy," he continued when she didn't immediately respond. "Frontier life is hard, especially for a woman used to city comforts. The winters are long, the work is never ending, and the nearest neighbors are miles away. But there's a freedom in it too, a chance to build something true." Abigail found herself remembering their conversations on the trail, the way he had spoken of the land with respect and understanding, the quiet competence with which he had cared for her injury, made camp, kept them safe. She thought of the peaceful evenings by the fire, the stars overhead more brilliant than she had ever seen in Boston, the sense of possibility that had grown with each day of their journey. "I hardly know you," she said softly, though even as the words left her mouth, she knew they weren't entirely true. In some ways, she felt she knew Alex Evans better after 4 days than she had known Henry Blackwell after months of correspondence. "You know the important parts," he countered. "And I know enough about you to want to learn the rest." A passing wagon rattled by, reminding them that they stood on a public street, their future hanging in the balance while the everyday business of Red Rock continued around them. Alex glanced toward the Blackwell trading post, then back to Abigail. "I'm not asking for a commitment," he clarified. "Just a chance. Come back to the homestead. Stay as long as you need to decide what you want, if that's teaching in Red Rock or returning east or—" He hesitated, then finished simply, "or something else entirely. I'll help you make it happen." The generosity of his offer moved her deeply. This was a man who had rescued her, cared for her, brought her safely to her destination, even knowing it might mean losing her. And now, when fate had unexpectedly intervened, he was offering her shelter and time, the two things she needed most. "What about propriety?" she asked, though it seemed a minor concern compared to the decision before her. "What would people think?" Alex smiled, a full, genuine smile that transformed his face. "The nearest neighbor who might care is 10 miles away, but if it matters to you, there's a pastor who visits the outlying homesteads once a month. He could marry us whenever you decide, if you decide that's what you want." Marriage. The word that had brought her west in the first place now carried an entirely different weight. Not a practical arrangement with a stranger, but a possibility to be considered, a future to be chosen rather than accepted. Abigail looked down the main street of Red Rock at the bustling frontier town that might still offer her a place if she chose to stay. Then she looked up at Alex, at the man who had come to mean so much to her in so short a time. "I would like to see the seasons change at your homestead," she said finally, her decision crystallizing even as she spoke the words. "I would like to learn about the land as you have, and I would like the time to discover if what I'm feeling now could grow into something lasting." The hope that blazed in Alex's eyes was answer enough, but his words confirmed it. "Nothing would make me happier." They stood for a moment, the decision made but the future still unwritten, until Alex broke the spell with a gentle suggestion. "We should find somewhere to stay tonight. It's too late to start back, and you'll want to speak with Blackwell again tomorrow about your refund." Abigail nodded, practical concerns reasserting themselves. "Yes, and I should perhaps look into this boarding house Margaret mentioned. I'll need proper clothing and a few necessities before we return to your home." "Our home," Alex corrected softly, the words an offer rather than an assumption. "Perhaps," she allowed, a smile playing at her lips. "In time." He helped her mount Thunder once more, then led the horse down the street toward the hotel he had spotted earlier. As they rode, Abigail found herself looking at Red Rock with new eyes, not as her final destination, but as a waypoint on a journey that had taken an unexpected but somehow perfect turn. The following morning, Abigail returned to Blackwell's trading post, this time dressed in a simple but proper dress purchased with part of the refund Henry had readily provided. Margaret, true to her word, had inquired about both the boarding house and the teaching position, and seemed genuinely pleased when Abigail explained that she had decided to take a different path. "You'll let us know if you change your mind?" Margaret asked, her kind face concerned. "The offer remains open." "Thank you," Abigail replied sincerely, "but I believe I've found where I'm meant to be." She glanced through the store window to where Alex waited outside with the horses, now including a sturdy mare he had purchased for Abigail to ride. He had insisted on buying her proper riding clothes as well, practical garments that would serve her well in her new life. Henry, who had been effusively apologetic throughout their interaction, seemed relieved by Abigail's sanguine acceptance of the situation. "If there's ever anything you need," he offered as she prepared to leave, "please don't hesitate to ask." "There is one thing," Abigail said, pausing at the door. "Could you send word to my aunt in Boston, let her know I'm safe and happy?" "Of course," Henry agreed readily. "I'll send a letter with the next eastbound stage." With that final connection to her past addressed, Abigail stepped out into the bright morning sunshine where Alex waited. He helped her mount her new horse, a gentle mare with a chestnut coat that he had named Penny, and they set off, riding side by side this time rather than sharing a mount. "Ready?" he asked as they reached the edge of town, the open country spreading before them. Abigail looked back once at Red Rock, then forward to the horizon and the man beside her. "Ready," she confirmed, and they rode together toward the future neither had anticipated but both now embraced. The journey back to Alex's homestead took on a different quality than their initial travel, more leisurely, more filled with conversation and laughter as they shared stories of their lives before meeting. Abigail told him of her childhood in Boston, of her father's bookshop where she had developed her love of reading, of her dreams that had been set aside when circumstances changed. Alex spoke of his experiences during the war, of his travels throughout the West, of the day he had found the piece of land that called to him and decided to put down roots. They camped again beneath the stars, but this time the tension between them was of a different sort, anticipatory rather than restrained, acknowledged rather than denied. When Alex's hand found hers beside the campfire, Abigail twined her fingers with his, accepting the connection that had been building since the moment he had lifted her from the dust. "I never expected this," she admitted as they sat watching the flames dance. "When I set out from Boston, I thought I knew exactly what my future held. Life has a way of surprising us," Alex replied, his thumb tracing circles on the back of her hand. "Sometimes for the better." "Definitely for the better," she agreed, leaning against his shoulder in a gesture that felt both new and familiar. They arrived at the homestead on the afternoon of the second day, the small cabin appearing over the rise exactly as Abigail remembered it. Yet it looked different somehow, transformed by the knowledge that it might become her home rather than just a temporary shelter. As Alex helped her dismount, his hands lingering at her waist, Abigail looked around at the modest homestead, the cabin with its stone chimney, the small corral where the horses would be kept, the garden plot that would need tending, the endless sky above. "It's not much," Alex said, echoing his words from their first meeting. "But it's perfect," Abigail interrupted, turning to face him fully. "It's exactly where I want to be." Something in her voice must have conveyed her certainty, because Alex's expression transformed, hope and joy breaking across his features like sunrise. "Abigail," he breathed, his hands still at her waist, drawing her closer. "Yes." She replied, her own hands coming to rest on his chest, feeling the strong beat of his heart beneath her palms. "When I found you on the trail, when I said those words, 'You're mine now,' I never imagined how much I would come to wish they were true," he confessed, his voice rough with emotion. Abigail smiled up at him, all doubts and hesitations swept away by the rightness of this moment, this place, this man. "Perhaps they were truer than either of us knew," she suggested. "Perhaps fate had plans we couldn't see." "Perhaps," he agreed, his eyes never leaving hers. "But now I'm asking properly. Stay with me, Abigail, not just for a while, not just until you decide what you want, but for always. Become my wife, my partner in this life I'm building." "I know it won't be easy, but I promise to," she silenced him with a finger to his lips, her eyes shining with unshed tears of happiness. "Yes," she said simply, "yes to all of it." The word had barely left her lips before Alex's mouth claimed hers in a kiss that spoke of longing finally fulfilled, of promises made and kept, of a future neither had imagined but both now embraced wholeheartedly. When they finally broke apart, breathless and laughing, the setting sun bathed the homestead in golden light, casting long shadows across the land that would be their home. "Welcome home, Abigail," Alex said softly, his arm around her waist as they turned to face the cabin together. "Home," she repeated, the word filling her heart with a joy she had never expected to find when she had set out on her journey west. "Yes, I believe it is." The visiting pastor married them 3 weeks later, a simple ceremony with only a few neighbors from distant homesteads as witnesses. Abigail wore a new dress sewn from fabric bought in Red Rock, with wildflowers in her hair instead of a veil. Alex stood tall and proud beside her, his usual work clothes replaced by the one good suit he owned, his face clean-shaven for the occasion. Their vows were straightforward but heartfelt, promises to cherish and support each other through whatever life might bring. When the pastor pronounced them husband and wife, the small gathering cheered as Alex kissed his bride with a tenderness that brought tears to the eyes of even the most stoic frontier women present. The modest celebration that followed a shared meal. Some music played on a neighbor's fiddle, congratulations and well wishes from people who had quickly accepted Abigail as one of their own felt more meaningful to her than any elaborate Boston society wedding could have been. As the last guests departed, the newlyweds stood together in the doorway of their cabin, watching the stars emerge in the vast prairie sky. "Happy?" Alex asked, his arm around her waist, his lips brushing her temple. "More than I ever thought possible," Abigail replied truthfully, leaning into his embrace. "And you?" "I have everything I never knew I wanted," he said, turning her to face him. "The day you fell from that wagon was the luckiest day of my life," she laughed, wrapping her arms around his neck. "I wouldn't have called it lucky at the time, but now I'm inclined to agree." He kissed her then, a kiss that held all the promise of the life they would build together, a life of hard work and simple pleasures, of challenges overcome and joys shared, of love found in the most unexpected of circumstances. "You're mine now," he whispered against her lips, echoing the words that had begun their journey together. "Truly and completely mine, and you are mine," she replied, her heart full to bursting with happiness, "just as we were meant to be." As Alex swept her into his arms to carry her across the threshold of their home, Abigail reflected on the strange twists of fate that had brought her to this moment. The fall from the wagon that had seemed like disaster had led her to the greatest blessing of her life. The journey west that had begun with practical considerations had ended in a love deeper and truer than anything she could have imagined. And as the door closed behind them, shutting out the world and enclosing them in the warmth of their home and their love, Abigail knew with absolute certainty that she had found where she belonged, not in the city she had left behind, not in the frontier town that had rejected her, but here, in this simple cabin on the prairie, with the man who had lifted her from the dust and changed her life forever. The years that followed brought challenges and joys in equal measure, as Alex had predicted. Winters were indeed harsh, but the cabin was warm with their love and the additions they made to it: another room, a larger kitchen, a covered porch where they could sit and watch the sunset. Summers brought abundant harvests from the expanded garden Abigail tended with increasing skill. Learning from neighbors and books, Alex brought back from his occasional trips to Red Rock. Their family grew with the arrival of twins, a boy and a girl, whose laughter filled the homestead, and whose curious minds delighted in the natural wonders surrounding them. Abigail taught them to read and write, to appreciate literature and history, while Alex showed them the ways of the land, how to ride and hunt and respect the wilderness that was their home. As the railroad came through and more settlers arrived, the community expanded. Abigail helped establish a small school, teaching part-time while maintaining their home. Alex's reputation for honesty and hard work brought opportunities: a position on the town council, partnerships with neighboring ranchers, respect from even those who had initially viewed his solitary ways with suspicion. And through it all, their love deepened and strengthened, tested by hardship but never diminished. Each night, as they lay together in the bed they shared, they marveled at the twist of fate that had brought them together: a bride thrown from a wagon, a cowboy who had stopped to help, and the words that had proven prophetic: "You're mine now." On their 10th anniversary, as they sat on their porch watching their children play in the yard that had once been empty prairie, Alex took Abigail's hand and pressed a kiss to her palm. "Any regrets?" he asked, a question he posed on this day each year. And as she had each year before, Abigail shook her head, her smile as radiant as the day he had first seen her lying in the dust in her torn wedding dress. "Not a single one," she replied, leaning her head on his shoulder and watching the sun set over the land they had made their own. "Not a single one,"